Thank you so much, and I'm happy to be up here again. So I'm here today to tell you guys a little bit about the Angular CLI. And so how many people here have used the CLI? OK, a lot of people here. So you may think you know what it is, right? You may think, oh, it's an open source project that's really there to design and to help you automate your workflow in terms of building Angular applications. But you're actually wrong. The Angular CLI is actually just magic, right? You put your commands in one end, the perfect Angular application comes out the other end. Or at least that's what a lot of people seem to think about it. There's sometimes some fear around using it and things like that because you're not necessarily sure what's going on under the hood. And one of my goals here today is really to help you see that while at the same time it is magic, it's also a little bit boring. It's doing some very kind of standard things that we've been doing for a long time as developers, but it's automating those for you. And it's figuring out when it should be doing those and trying to take care of them for you. So I'm going to walk through a relatively standard developer workflow here. So I'm going to go into scaffolding and building an application. I'm going to get into generating different parts of an application, going into serving and going into that dev lifecycle and that dev loop. We'll talk about building applications, testing, and then we'll finally get into a little bit about distribution. So let's start with scaffolding. Before you can build anything with the Angular CLI, you need to install it via npm. I think we're all using npm at this point, so that's not really a concern. So we're going to install it globally. And then I'm going to run a very simple command, ng new, and you're going to give it a project name. So I've used my new project here. Magic! You now have an Angular application. It works. It's got tests. It runs. It's fantastic, right? But there's not actually a lot going under the hood at this stage of an application development. So if you look at the Angular CLI source code, what's actually happened at this point is we've taken the title that you've given us, and we've loaded that as a variable. And then we're loading what's called a blueprint, which is basically just a set of static files, as well as a JavaScript source code file. And then we're putting that file onto your hard drive. A little bit beyond that, there's something more in terms of what we're doing in the blueprints. So the blueprints are actually constructed to take into account all of the things that are going on in the Angular style guide. So these emerging best practices about how we should be building applications, we're trying to bake all of those things in so that when you create a project, you're already taking advantage of those things. We've also identified all of the npm dependencies we feel like you'll need. And then we've also set up some of the configuration that makes using TypeScript a little bit easier, as well as that makes using testing easier. And then finally, we've given you a couple default environment files that really try and set you up for future development and for scaling your development process out as your build process gets a little bit more complicated. There's actually a few different parameters. I'm just going to go over them very, very briefly. So you've got dry run if you don't actually want to touch anything. You can specify a blueprint manually. You can even skip that really long npm step if you want to do that a little bit later on your own. You can specify a different source directory if you want to. You can say what type of styling you want to use, whether you want to use Sass or less or just normal CSS. And then you can also supply a prefix that's going to be used whenever you generate a component. So here's an example usage of the ng new command. There's also an alias for ng init if you're already in the directory you want to be targeting. And then here we're going to be skipping the npm install, and I'm going to be saying, please put it in the source directory, as I normally would. I want to use normal CSS for all of my styles. And then because I work for Google, I'm going to use the goog prefix. And that's going to follow a very simple process of installing, kind of inflating all of those files, replacing any of the variables that existed there. And then it's going to move on from there. Then, now you actually have a nice scaffold within which you can build your application. And we're going to then want to start putting things into our application. There's actually a very simple command for this, ng generate, also ngg. And then there's a number of different parameters that you can apply in terms of what you want to be building. So right now, the Angular CLI can build classes, components, directives, enums, modules, pipes, and services. And with each of these things, you're going to get a different blueprint coming in, and they're going to have a little bit of different parameters that you could be passing. But you've got all of those best practices baked in, and you've also got a couple more magical things. So for example, if I want to use ng generate component header, what we're actually going to do is we're going to take that name that you gave us, and we're going to use that and create a folder for that. We're going to use that and create the name of the component, so we'll call it header component with proper capitalization. And then we'll also make sure that that's being reflected as a dependency throughout your application. Another example here would be if I want to do a module generation, where I want to generate a module foo. And one of the optional command line parameters you can provide here is routing. And what routing will do here is it will actually create another module as an import to this one that just supplies the routing for that module. which can be very helpful when you're starting to build out more complex applications. Here's a more complicated example. So now, instead of just generating a component header where we're going to infer and just guess where you want that, we're going to say, here's the path that I want for that header. I want it flat. So by default, we're going to create a folder for every component, which was going to follow those best practices of putting a .ts file, a .html file, .css file all next to each other. But here, maybe I want all of those files in the same place. Maybe I don't want testing for some crazy reason. I'm going to specify that I want an inline template instead of a separate file, and I'll do the same with styles here. One of the really cool things is if you already have built a complex application with nested modules, when you create a new component, we're actually going to look at the tree around you and figure out where should we add the declaration for that component. The ngGenerate command, as I said before, it's going to be using a blueprint. And so what that blueprint, again, is going to do is, if you look in the source code of the Angular CLI, there's a single JavaScript file that's going to say, hey, maybe I want to resolve what the ng module is for that, and then I'm going to install that blueprint and replace all those parameters. And I've included here a little sample snippet from within the Angular CLI code, and you're going to see that AST utils. And what that's actually going to do is it's going to use a semantic understanding of your application. And we're actually generating a tree via static analysis of what you've written, so that we're not just doing regular expression replacements. It's a much more intelligent way of adding things to your application that you're going to be a little bit more confident that things aren't going to be breaking. So the next up is serving. So serving is a relatively complex step. You type ngserve, boom, your website is running, right? We've actually done a ton of different steps for you at this stage of the process. So all of these things we've done before in terms of gulp tasks, Webpack commands, things like that. So we're going to compile any of your styles. We're going to invoke TypeScript and do all of the appropriate transpilation based on your TS config. We're going to be using Webpack to bundle your JavaScript, your CSS. We're doing asset optimization. There's actually a virtual file system that's been created just locally for serving all of those assets and all of those compiled versions. And then you get nice things like the live reload that we're all very used to for shortening the development cycle between when I hit save and when I see those changes live. And then lastly, we've got one of my favorite kind of cool new features, which is code splitting, where the Angular CLI now, if you're using routing, which you may have heard about other times at Angular Connect here, if you use load children, we're actually going to recognize that via the CLI and bundle those separately so that any dependencies in those modules are not going to be loaded as part of your main bundle. And you're actually going to be pulling those parts out of the critical path of your application, which can make your application bundle much smaller and make loading it much more performant. But a lot of people kind of worry, like, hey, there's all these tools that are CLI specific. But what we've actually done is we've started pulling out all of those pieces that can be just Webpack plugins into this ng tools scope on NPM. And so you've got ng tools Webpack. So the idea is that if you're building a normal Webpack application and you don't want to be using the CLI, you can still take advantage of those things like code splitting. There's actually a couple other things that you can do with ngserve. So you can supply an environment. So I talked about how we're actually going to give you out of the box a production and a development environment. So these are just TypeScript files or JavaScript files that you can say whatever sort of setup or parameterization you want to do to make sure that your application takes into account the environment that you're building it for. And the other half of that is you can actually specify a target. And so this says, how do we want to be building this application? So whenever you specify target production, we're going to then apply additional Webpack optimizations. So you get the minification, you get the uglification that's going to take out all of your comments, and it's going to give you a really small performant bundle. So when we think about building, building is actually very similar to serving, right? So you can use ng-build. Most of the time, personally, I use -- prod because it's about as fast and gives me a very optimized build. Magic, again. So what you're going to see here is it's just like the ngserve step, where we're going to be running all of those optimizations, all of those bundling steps, all of the minification steps. But then we're also going to be doing the code splitting and things like that. But then we're going to see because we've done the -- prod flag, we're going to be targeting both the production environment and the production target. And then finally, the most important part is that you get a real file system. The next step is testing. So we've talked a lot about this at this conference, about how important it is to do testing. And so as you're writing an Angular application and as you're using the Angular CLI, anytime you generate something, we're going to be giving you tests somewhat automatically, right? So when I generate a new component, not only am I going to get the HTML and the CSS standard files that let me build that, but I'm also going to be getting a spec file that gives me the configuration that I need to start writing tests. And then the ng command allows you to run both these unit tests as well as end-to-end tests. And this is not just true for Angular things like components, but you'll also see this on things like classes. So that the moment you're generating an ES6 class, we're going to be putting a spec file there for you. When you look at how we do this under the hood, we're actually really trying to stand on the shoulders of giants, so to say. So we're using some of the best practices and the industry standard tools for testing Angular applications, such as Protractor, such as Karma, and just baking these things in as default. So when you ng-newed your project, you actually got a Karma configuration file out of the box. One of the last steps that you want to do when you build an Angular application with the CLI is you want to make sure that it's distributed, right? You want your users to actually see it. We actually have a path called ng GitHub pages deploy. How many people here have used GitHub pages? OK, so we've got a smattering of hands here. GitHub pages is a really fantastic way of, with very little effort, putting front-end client-side code onto a server that's powered by GitHub, and then rendering that server to the world. And so we've built it all into a single command, but it's actually taking care of a bunch of the steps that you normally have to do manually, right? So we've built your project whenever you run this sort of deployment. We're creating the appropriate Git branch with the layout that GitHub is expecting for that. We're committing that into that branch, and then we're pushing that up to GitHub, with the idea being that you can go from having code that runs locally to code that runs remotely, all basically in a single command. But part of the build process is the creation of this dist folder. And I really feel that the dist folder is awesome, because when it comes to building Angular applications and really any sort of single-page applications, one of the magical parts of it is the portability. I can take that dist folder and I can put it into something like a GitHub pages website via the GH pages branch, but I can also put it onto a Firebase server. I can also put it onto any sort of server that I want, regardless of the backend, because of that portable client-side code that's going to be running. So we've talked a lot about what it can kind of do today, but the last section that I want to spend a little bit of time on is understanding what the future has for the Angular CLI. So one of the things that we've talked a fair amount about is ahead-of-time compilation. This week, you're going to be seeing a preview flag, so --AOT, when you use the Angular CLI. And what that allows you to do is it will allow you to write your application in JIT mode, so just-in-time mode, in the same way that most people have been doing since the beginning of Angular 2. And we're going to use that virtual file system, and we're going to use kind of an automatic configuration step to swap things out. So we're going to run all of the ngc commands that need to be run to make your application work in AOT. And then we're going to automatically bootstrap those things for you using the ng module factories rather than the ng modules. Another thing that's very powerful is mobile. So building progressive web apps, as I mentioned earlier in yesterday morning's keynote, is a way of targeting more users and giving users a progressively better experience when you build an Angular application. And there's actually a mobile flag that makes it easier for you to do that. And so that's coming soon, but there's a lot of work going on there that will enable you to take advantage of combinations of things like universal and mobile, so that where you can render an app shell for users and then load all of the additional content via service workers. Another capability that's coming for the Angular CLI is the ability to do refactoring. So I mentioned this semantic understanding that we have of your application. We actually can see statically how your application is loading and how it flows. And then what we can do is we're working on, and we've got some prototypes, to extend the way that the CLI empowers you so that, for example, instead of just generating a component, you could move a component from one module to another, or refactor a component by renaming it. Some of those things are a little bit tough today, and so the Angular CLI is really designed to make those easier. Another thing that the Angular CLI can do that is a really important thing for us is upgrades. So moving between major Angular versions is by design going to be relatively straightforward. We've got a very good deprecation policy in place, as well as lots of plans to make sure that it's easy. But we believe that the Angular CLI can make this process even easier by combining our understanding of what's changed in Angular and then also our semantic understanding of your application, so that as many of these things that we can do to help you adapt to the latest breaking changes every few months, we are going to do that automatically. Additionally, with the CLI, there's a lot of work right now and a lot of thought going into how do we make the CLI extensible via add-ons. So think of adding another deployment target. So GitHub Pages is a good start, but what if I want to deploy to Heroku or Firebase? We want to be able to empower people to add these things onto the CLI. We also want to find a way that, without exposing too much of the underpinnings of the Angular CLI, we want to actually enable you to, because we're using Webpack, we want to enable you to modify some of those things as well. Next is performance. Right now, we're doing file watching, and we're doing some intelligent diffing to figure out what things we need to be recompiling and modifying, but there's a lot more we can do to make the Angular CLI faster. And then the last piece is something that I've actually heard from a lot of different developers, which is that, hey, I have to build a library or a shared pack for other developers. How do I do that? And while we're working on documentation to make that better, we also feel that the CLI can be an answer to that, where if you know that you're targeting other developers as a consumer of a library rather than building an application, we can help you package some of those things. So those are some of the things that we're very excited about that are coming soon as part of the Angular CLI. I want to take a moment to thank the team working on the Angular CLI. So it's actually mostly open source contributors at this point. It's a very tight-knit team. And so if you look at some of the changes over the last few months of the CLI, one of the things we did is we shifted from System.js to Webpack. And we really did that as a reaction to the community. So this team here absolutely wants to reiterate that they are listening to your feedback, your concerns, and your desires. So if there's something that you want to see in the CLI or an experience that you've had and you want to share with them, definitely go ahead and contact them on Twitter. Or you can also file an issue on the GitHub. Or finally, if you want to join the conversation, there's also an active Gitter. Thank you so much.